very eminent panel who's going to be engaging on this subject. To my extreme left, Shafi Golwasser, Director, Siemens Institute of Theory of Computing, Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of California, Berkeley. To her right, Vikram Sharma, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Quintessence Labs Australia. And to my immediate left is Amos Yardley, Executive Director, Institute for National Security Studies, Israel. One of the features of this age that we live in is the breadth of technologies that are available for commercial, humanitarian, and military purposes. In fact, if 2019 was to be the year of examination, we have seen the deployment of drones to attack facilities. We have seen autonomous systems being used to assassinate global leaders, and we've seen massive cyber attacks on civilian and commercial infrastructure. Much of the technology that was meant to connect the world, create value and businesses, is now being used to harm people, societies, and countries. And this panel is going to interrogate the key question of regulating technologies that have great civilian benefits and can have terrible violent consequences. So let me first start with Vikram. Vikram, why is technology development in terms of its dual use character different today from during the Cold War?
Well, thank you, Samir, and good morning. I think we see a significant difference in the pathways for technology development, and indeed the funding sources. In the Cold War, we very much saw that strategic technologies were being funded and developed by governments largely, with industry more coming in as partners in there. And the idea was to develop strategic or military advantage through the technologies that were developed therefrom. Today, we're seeing a significant difference, or perhaps a transition might be a better way to term it, where industry is participating much more actively, and often the role of government is coming in as a partner there. That in turn leads to, in many cases, a broader dissemination, such as just the technologies you talked about, where earlier they were in a controlled fashion. Now, because they're coming through industry, there's a much broader proliferation and dissemination of those technologies.
So, Shafi, let me turn this debate over to you now. How do you manage this proliferation of technologies? How do you ensure technologies directed for civilian purposes remain civilian in nature and are not deployed for military purposes by state and non-state actors?
So I think that this is just to understand the nature of the problem. So the way I see it, when you talk about technologies, often you're talking at this day and age about AI systems, which can be deployed for lots of fantastic goods, as we know, and they're based on a lot of data held by individuals and entities. But at the same time, because the software is usually open and publications are out there in journals that everybody can read, you can also take the ideas and sometimes the systems and change them slightly and use them and misuse them for purposes that they were not intended. So the question is, what do you do about it? So there's several schools of thought out there. One of them says don't publish and have a pre-publication scrutiny to make sure that somebody decides whether this is something that can be misused or not. So that's obviously not a good idea. In fact, I'm totally against it. It's something that's very similar that's come up in the area of cryptography and encryption debate, which is sort of my specialty. So that's the first thing that sometimes comes up, and I think that we should be dead set against that. The second thing is that there's a difference between publishing and having a system out there. And when you put a system out there, even open source is different than having a system that you can actually use and execute. So systems, especially AI systems, often need a lot of resources. They need a lot of computational power. Sometimes they need special hardware. It's not clear that the computational barrier is so easy to cross. And that's something that you might even use to your advantage. If you want to make it so that if you know some secret or you have access to something that enables you to run the technology versus not have access to it, then it might make a difference between the people who can run the technology and people who cannot run the technology. Again, I'm thinking as a cryptographer or someone who comes from security, where the notion of a trapdoor, the notion of knowing something about the code enables you to run it versus not run it, or enable you to disable it versus not disable it. So that brings me just to one more thing that I wanted to mention, and that is that really this leads to this question of governance. Can you sort of have control over these systems that you put out to ensure, in some sense, that they're not misused? So obviously, categorically, no, but to some extent, yes, because if you make the software such that it's hard to modify, then you've effectively made it much more difficult for someone to misuse it. How do you make something hard to modify? Maybe by making it hard to understand exactly which part to modify, which in cryptography we call obfuscation. Some sort of, it's very related to software protection.
So you're saying the security lies in the design itself. The way you design the blueprint for a system can perhaps also ensure that it is not being able to be captured and misused by others, right?
That's right. You want to make it difficult.
Difficult
To misuse it. So capturing is not enough. I mean, if you capture something and you use it as is, that's not a problem.
Doesn't matter.
The problem is that you are modifying it. And then the last thing is sort of watermark, but maybe I could talk about it in the next.
No, sure, go ahead.
So okay, let's say that all that fails, and you want to know, I guess, in analogy to nuclear weapons, you want to be able to know where that code is, who's gotten the code. Then another possibility is, in some sense, to watermark the code so that even if it's modified, there is some trace in it that you can later identify.
So the traceability of the systems itself.
Yeah. And then it means really that the next question is, so what? So now you know that somebody took your code. You can trace it to some original code. How do you prevent misuse? And again, we can talk about that, but
Okay.
Next
So let me come to Amos Yadlin. One of the really hot topics these days is autonomous vehicles. But in the World Economic Forum article that I've had the privilege of reading, and I think it's being released today, you are skeptical about the use of autonomous systems in the battlefield.
Yes. I think first I want to refer to what you said about drones and using drones for bad things. And I think it's the right way to present it. Killing a terrorist by drone can be a good thing. It can defend, it can deter the bad guys. So the issue is not how you do it, what is the means of doing it, by rifle, by drone, by airplane, by gun, whatever. The issue is, what is the objective? Is it moral? Is it immoral? It has nothing to do with technology, nothing. So speaking about autonomous system in the battlefield, what I'm saying is that it's not as simple as having an autonomous car, because autonomous car and even the cars are not there at the time that everybody promised. They still have a lot of problems. But they have roads, they know the rules of the game, and nobody wants to kill them. The battlefield is much more complex, much more complex. If the road have left and right and speed, like 3 axes, in the battlefield sometimes you have 20 axes. If it's an airplane, it's 6 degrees of movement. And there is, of course, the other side. And the Cornet missiles will kill an autonomous tanks as well as it will kill a manned tanks. So the issue of technology adapting through AI is much more difficult for the battlefield than for the normal civil life. And AI, as we all know, depend on a huge data. And the data is there. If there are medical files, there are millions of them. Where is the data for the battlefield coming from? We don't go to wars, thank God, every day. And there is no million wars or scenarios. You can simulate them, but then there is the bias of who built the simulation. And I am not saying that somewhere in 2090 there will not be something like that. But I'm saying in my article, it is not in the coming decade.
Now, you also write about the law of 2 3s, and in some sense how that implicates the development of the battlefield. Can you elaborate on that for those who are
40
watching?
years of serving in IDF and 20 of them being in the area of developing new systems. Not from the technology point of view, but from the performance in battle point of view. it was always seen as what you promised to me, you, the engineers, is coming 2 times late. If you promise 5, it's 10 years. If you promise that it will be 10 million, it's 200 million. And if you promise this performance, it's half of it. That's basically what I have learned. In a complex, once again, it is not applied to a single, one purpose.
It's a complex system.
Yeah, when it's complex, it's much more difficult than developing an application to iPhone.
So let me be provocative. It is normally delayed, it's overpriced, and it underperforms. That's basically what you just said. I want you to come in on this.
If I could add, just perhaps building on Amos's point there about the complexity, perhaps vis-a-vis technologies from decades ago. One is that traditional mechanisms which we've used of deterrence and of reprisal don't really work in the world today with many of the technologies we're talking about, because attribution is extremely difficult for many of the types of technologies, whether they're information technology, cybersecurity based, or
even drones.
Or even drones for that matter. Of course, then the other couple of things I just wanted to point out as challenges are the asymmetry of defense versus offense. You know, offensive capabilities can be launched from anywhere with great impact. Defending against those requires tremendously greater number of resources. And the final point on that is,
but that makes it very, I mean, sorry to interrupt you. That makes it very attractive for non-state actors. I would argue that
was going to be exactly my third point, that has also one of the new dynamics, relatively newer dynamics perhaps one could say, is that now you not only have well-defined state actors, but many non-state actors that have come into the picture, which continually, as Amos was saying, makes that situation very complex.
However, having a real cyber attack on a real infrastructure of a country is not something that can be done by a terrorist from a basement in Afghanistan. You do need huge computing capability to trace, to study the system you want to attack. You have to develop a cyber weapon to introduce it into the adversary system. You have to keep connection with it. You have to have the capability to initiate it on the right time. It is not as simple. See, the terrorists, since September 11, think that 3,000 people killed is not enough. They want to do something more. And they were unable to do it in the last 2 decades because it's not that simple.
Shafi, is it that simple? I mean, since this is your area now, in the IT, in information systems, is it difficult for a non-state actor to mount a massive attack on a critical infrastructure in an adversary country?
So I think that one has to also realize that these massive attacks are not the only danger that we're facing. So there's also civil issues with this technology. So for example, political issues, the synthetic language and video usage to impersonate, the fact that you could have fake news that are extremely deep and impossible to differentiate from reality. That is also a misuse. That is very different than drones or, doing a massive attack on a country's infrastructure, but can have as devastating effects. Sometimes you may argue even more.
We get a wrong person elected in a country.
Or if you get it elected based on incorrect facts and incorrect beliefs, then that's not the way that things should progress, and they can go to a very dangerous direction. Another thing is, which is maybe less sort of devastating, is algorithmic decision-making that now is taking over a lot of sectors, and that can be used to amplify biases, to maybe make the wrong decisions, and we don't understand these systems so well, and if we're going to make decisions based on these automated systems, we have to be a little wary about it. So that's another way that you can sort of think about this technology that everybody's so happy to use instead of what we've used before we understand exactly the power of it. So, these are not the same type of attacks that we're talking about. They are dangerous. They are easier to...
They're more insidious, and they are maybe more gentle in their invasion, but more,
maybe they have more
debilitating in their outcome.
Long-term effect and not even detectable. And those type of things, I think, are easier to do without having a state type of resources. So, and I think those are the type of things where maybe you can trace who are the people who engaged in it, and you can talk about penalties. So it's not the same severity, you know, killing and drones and terrorism, but it is our society. It's happening, and it's easy to happen. So the question, I think one should also pay some attention to how to mitigate these type of problems and how to have some kind of, I don't know what policy, but penalties. I think if there's a way to automatically impose huge penalties on this type of misuse of technology would be very interesting.
You know, let me ask you all, you want to respond?
Yeah, I think this is a very good point. It's an attempt to attack our capability to distinguish between what is true and what is false. And we have in our society truth tellers. It can be the academic, it can be the media, it can be the intelligence agencies. And what we see, once again, not by a private citizen, by a superpowers, by a strong state campaign, because all these boats that are private are getting lost in the noise.
I agree.
But when it's a campaign done by a superpower to achieve a political goal, it is a real danger. But we have identified the danger. And then we are knowing every time to develop countermeasures. And this is the challenge for all of us. How we protect our society from this post-truth fake news campaigns. And what I'm looking is for some kind of software development that will help us to distinguish between what is true and what is wrong. It's a huge philosophical issue, but it's also a technological issue in the cyber realm.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Let me pose a question to all three of you. Is there a need for a new arrangement, a new multi-stakeholder coalition to respond to the challenges and opportunities around emerging tech? So are you seeing a change in the nature of conversations between experts like Shafi, business folks like Vikram, and intelligence folks like Amos? Are you seeing a new alliance or a new arena being created to have these important conversations? Has something changed?
Happy to offer an opinion on that. I think certainly the conversations are much stronger than they have been before. There is a genuine openness, I think, between the three sectors that you talked about. I think broadly we're trying to strike that right balance. As you said, there's tremendous civilian benefits from many of these technologies, whether it's quantum, it's AI, or cybersecurity. However, I think the three dimensions that we've typically seen around governance models that Shafi talked about, can we have some measures around non-proliferation, for example? Do we have something around the security of those technologies and ensure the safety of our civilian populations? And really that then boils down into three specific initiatives, I think, where the conversation is revolving around. So how do we prevent the misuse of those technologies, I think very much as Shafi was saying. How can we introduce controls around handling of information and materials related to those sensitive technologies? And finally, can we have measures to promote the safe use of those technologies?
And do you think there is a possibility of something beyond just the companies talking to themselves emerging, you know, beyond the self-regulation and beyond the company-led initiatives? Can we see a UN or a global initiative that promotes these three?
Well, I think certainly we're seeing like the role of government from, as we were saying in the Cold War, of being the driver of innovation, perhaps turning to be a guardian of civil rights and safety. So I think governments probably have a very significant role to play in bringing this together. But I interestingly find gatherings such as this that we're having here this week as great fora for driving that dialogue.
Shafi, let me come to you because you are from Berkeley, and you know, West Coast and DC have had a slightly complicated relationship around the questions of technology rights, access to information and data. How do you see this relationship evolving in the days ahead?
I've only moved to the West Coast a year and a half ago. I was in Boston. I was in MIT for many years, so I don't know if I can speak as a West Coaster. But it is true that, for example, in the encryption debate, there was a big issue, right? So the government, FBI, and so forth wanted to pursue to make sure that they have all the keys,
Correct.
or the big companies, the digital media companies, will give them the keys to people's software, and the technology companies don't want to, because then they claim that nobody's going to use their products overseas. There's going to be people go dark and so forth, and the debate it still goes on. I think that it seems overwhelmingly to be the case that they're not going to give away, essentially, the keys freely, that they're not going to let the FBI pursue, their investigations without any control. And the reason in the encryption debate case is that it hasn't really been proven that letting them have access to all information is useful, or that it's really allowed them to pursue people to justice, to pursue criminals more successfully. So how it's going to be in terms of the AI technology, it's hard to tell, but I do think that your previous idea about having some sort of body that involves commercial, researchers and governments talking about and recognizing this idea of distinguishing truth from fake as a real threat and a very immediate worry that we can detect, but we have to want to do it. We have to employ good, science, good technology for it. I think it's of utmost importance. I mean, it's
Amos, relationship between, say, Israeli tech companies and the Israel state. Has that changed?
Yeah. I'm going back to your first question about moving from state to private sector. And I think it is well known that states become weaker and corporation become stronger. A state has no budgets, they are in deficit, and corporations have a lot of money that can be channeled to R&D. And we have to be aware that unlike the Cold War, and this is in a way the title of this session, unlike the Cold War, most of the innovation is done not in the government, but in the industry and the private sector. And we have to be aware to it. And in the past, the private sector adapted innovation and technologies that were prepared for war or for space and use them for everyday life. And today is the other way around. In Israel, I think we have a unique phenomena, and this is the fact that everybody is serving. Everybody is serving, so the state and the IDF, and especially the intelligence, have the capability to draft the best 1% elite, the brightest and the smartest, and give them basically, during their military service, a huge opportunity to be the next innovators in the marketplace when they finish their 3, 5, 10 years of serving. In this environment, which is quite open, young men can lead a group to a very innovative operation, intelligence operation. Teams learning how to work together. They debrief the failures openly. They are not paying something to the investors. And in this very unique ecosystem, Israel is preparing the private sector of the future when they move on. So the relations are a benefit for both, for the military on one hand, to the state, and then to the companies in the coming years.
So the alliance, the loose alliance or a strong alliance is built very early on. That's the point you're making between the civilian and the non-civilian sectors. Let me open it up to all of you. We have approximately 8 minutes. We can have a few questions, and speakers here, I'm sure, will be able to respond to you. So let's go to the gentleman here. Please briefly introduce yourself and ask.
Hi, I'm Kenji from Nikkei. My question is regarding China, because you talked about the role of the state. if the state, even though there's all these problems in the democratic countries, there are ways in which if there are maluse of technology, you can go through the judicial process, and also they need to care about the voters and stuff. But China has a very different political system where they don't have to care about their own people. The judicial system doesn't really work, and now, but they have the technology. Would you please address the issue of China, especially yesterday when Ren Zhengfei of Huawei was asked this question about the dual-use technology, and he said, well, if everyone has it, then it's like a stick. It doesn't really matter. That's what he said. So would you please give you a comment? I don't know.
And let me expand this question. When state has access to all technologies for the purposes of its statecraft, and when a state has access to all its technology companies for the purpose of statecraft, then what is the world supposed to do? I think that's two parts of the question. Do you want to come in as well? We'll take a couple of questions.
Sure. Yonadav Shavit, a machine learning researcher at Harvard. What I was wondering is about investment decisions. So every technology has anticipated dual-use side effects. And I wonder what your thoughts are on the sort of frameworks for when we should decide not to invest in a technology. Like, for example, in extreme high-performance facial recognition, drones that can fly through forests at 40 miles an hour or whatever. How do you go about deciding when it is not worth it to put in the investment in technology because it could be used very obviously for ill?
And there is a debate these days on, we are trying to play catch up. We allow the creation of technologies that are completely unmanageable. I think there's a debate here that should we allow AI to go down a certain path without thinking about investment decisions in the sector today. And I think that's the point he's making. There was one more hand here, yeah, the last speaker, and then I'll give you all a minute and a half each to respond to them.
Kevin Esfeld, MIT, CRISPR gene drive, etc. No one has mentioned bio. And bio is an interesting space in which bioweapons can theoretically be autonomous. We now know we have solid examples of reliable biological constructs that thankfully are defense biased, which a single researcher can access and unleash and edit an entire species. Presumably this could be done with actually offense-based technologies as well. Most innovation is done not in the private sector, not in the government, but by academics who do not have security backgrounds, who do not understand the consequences of what they are doing. And it appears that academia is quite a bit ahead of everyone that might have that sort of anticipatory consequences. But we cannot even educate them without introducing information hazards concerning the potential varieties of threats. We're not screening DNA synthesis. How do we get about solving
Great question. Should I start with you, Amos, and go down 1.5 minutes each?
China is an example to the fact that the world as a whole is unable to reach an agreement on cyber and on technologies that both sides see the advantage of it and don't want to sacrifice. Maybe not on the same dimension, because China is more interested in stealing IP, and the US is more interested in espionage, traditional espionage on China. And they cannot reach an agreement on what is the rules of the game. What is the just war theory for the era of cyber? We know how to handle missiles and nuclear bomb and tanks and airplanes. This area is still by decision of both sides, not treated, not reach the real comprehensive agreement. And last word, ethical issues are important. Technology is not standing alone. And I'm coming to the argument of technology in the battlefield. You need strategy, you need innovation, you need human intuition, and you need ethical rules. So any new technology, and let's go also to the biology issue, it's not standalone. It should be in an envelope of some decision, what are the rules of the game, what is the ethics, what is the philosophy behind it, and how you prevent its moving to be a weapon. We knew very well how to do it with nuclear weapon. It's much more difficult when it's come to a very small invention that may be catastrophic, even though what I said about cyber, I'm not an expert to weaponization, but I think it's also not that simple.
Vikram.
Perhaps I jump to the question of the investment decisions. I think what we're seeing is, as we said earlier, for such dual-use technology, it was largely driven by the state and focused, perhaps what we're seeing, to your point, Amma, in China, with very focused developments of technologies around things which will confer strategic advantage. I think in a number of other nations, what we are seeing, though, is, again, to your point, the lead being taken up by the commercial sector. They're arriving at their investment decisions still largely on the basis of commercial returns and outcomes. Although I do see that a lot of them are starting to balance that off against some of the ethical questions that we are grappling with. That's where the role, I think, of the state potentially comes in as well, because we see the states as acting as shepherds for pursuing those technologies which are not necessarily solely driven by economic gain, but also may have some greater either national advantage or general civilian good.
Yeah. Just 2 words. I was asked by some companies to be their ethical advisor, what we develop and what we don't develop, whom we sell our product and whom we are not selling our product. So maybe it's a good idea.
So the new career choice for many of
Not
us.
to hire me, but hire somebody else.
Kids in the laboratory.
Oh, yeah.
How do you regulate them? You know,
In the
the quest for discovery in the biology lab. How do you?
So actually, I think it's very interesting whether one can implement some of the lessons from, let's say, cybersecurity in the biology lab. Maybe it's possible to make the same biological agents or things that you're creating, to having them some sort of a trapdoor that it cannot be changed, or to watermark it. I mean, I know these are mathematical constructs, but it stands to reason that they have some biological analogies. And obviously, besides that, which is a technological measure, educating people from the beginning. And having someone around that's not trained as a biologist, but trained in another way that people respect. So I've seen that in computer science. The ethics courses that we had at MIT, nobody used to take them. Now they're full. All the students are taking them. Everybody's interested in fairness of algorithms and responsibility and all that. But it just shifted within like 2 years. And I've been at MIT for 35 years. So it's people becoming aware of it. And awareness seems to have huge impact.
Great. So I think that brings us to the close of this briefing session discussing the dilemma of dual-use technology. I think 3 words stand out for me: education, ethics, and of course, multilateralism or multi-stakeholderism, creating the arenas that can manage, govern, and regulate the use of technologies that can do immense damage, but also offer a great chance for many of us to confront the challenges of today. So thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.